welcome to Orwellian, the podcast dedicated to the essays of George Orwell. When you hear the word Orwellian, what do you think of? Terrifying dystopias? State surveillance? The loss of personal freedom? Well, we think of tea, pubs, and the common toad. Join us, and we'll tell you why. Welcome back, everyone. My name is Lewis, and I'm here with my co-host,
Simon.
And this week we're going to be discussing the George Orwell essay known as I Please 45. But before we start, Simon, I believe you've had a bit of an existential crisis recently.
I have, Lewis. So I haven't told you this yet, have I? I just told you I'm having a crisis. So remember I told you I sent off to a company to have my DNA tested?
Yes.
To know my heritage. Well, my results came back today, and to my huge surprise, it turns out I'm 2% English.
Just 2%?
2% English.
What's the biggest percentage?
So I'm 47.5% Celt.
Ah.
But Irish, Scots, Welsh.
Brother.
I know. Well, you're probably 65% English when you get yours done.
But it's likely. It's very likely.
It wasn't a huge surprise. So my grandmother, my mother's mother, is Welsh, or was Welsh. She was from Colwyn in North Wales. And it's so specific. It says you're 47.5% Irish, Scots, Welsh. I mean, in even more detail, it says likely North Wales, Northwest England. Okay? And she was from Colwyn, or near Colwyn Bay in North Wales. So I think that's where it comes from. And my father's mother's maiden name was Keane.
Irish.
Which, obviously, she's come from Irish stock. So I think that's where that comes from. Then 44% Norwegian Swedish.
Really?
Yeah.
That's a bit of a wild card, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I'm 6'1".
It makes sense.
I have a ginger beard. And I'm mighty with a sword, and I like drinking.
And I've often seen you like beating up monks.
Yeah, and like sacking Northumbrian villages. And I bloody love IKEA.
Who doesn't?
I'm poor. That's Swedish, isn't it? So that explains.
You've often been inside a Volvo.
Anyway, I was 2% Finnish and.
Sorry, I'll let you finish.
Oh, very good, very good.
Punja.
He's on fire. 2% English, and then 1% South Italian.
That's interesting.
I think some great-great-grandmother had a fling with some handsome Italian barber in 1805 or something. At least I hope that's the story. I need to talk to Mum. So
you always made a lot about your French Huguenot ancestry. Was there any indication of that at all?
Nothing. No, this is why I'm a tad sceptical. My surname, my father's surname is Perry, which is Norman. Perry is pear cider, and it was brought over from Normandy to the southwest of England. My mother's maiden name was Roulier, which is most definitely Huguenot. So
French on both sides, you would think.
French on both sides, but obviously those names have somehow come about through marriage and various connections. Or maybe somewhere down the line, the name Roulier was adopted, as opposed to being something that had been passed through the ages. They might have had a completely different name for some reason or other, adopted the name Roulier. I mean, we're talking maybe 300-400 years ago. So
just to recap, you are really mostly Celtic and Scandinavian.
Apparently so.
Which in a way doesn't surprise me, because you're if you don't mind me saying so, you're a very British sort of person. And Britons are, the genetic makeup in Britain, I think, is mostly Celtic and Scandinavian.
Yeah. But then people always say to me, Simon, you look so English. If we could have a stereotypical English face, you have it. So my question to them and myself now is, what is English? Genetically, because apparently I'm 2% English,
well,
but I look English.
Something Orwell himself would have been pretty interested in. Imagine testing George Orwell's genetics.
True. And when it says you're 2% English genetically, who are the genetic English?
The Saxons, I suppose.
But where did the Saxons come from?
Well, from
Northern Germany. And where did the Northern Germans come from? Apparently they came down from Scandinavia and across from the Hungary area. So,
And then before that, we're all, Indo-European, and before that,
we
we're
all
all
come from
African.
what's now known as Pakistan, and that area is where we all originally came from. So I had questions, but it was very interesting. So I haven't asked you yet. Are you thinking about doing it?
Yes, I am. I'm turning 30 this year. I know you might not be able to tell from my baby soft skin, but I'm turning 30 this year.
Well, the people listening to this can't see you, and they can't believe you're just 30. They're like, he's not 65.
So I'm turning 30 this year, and my mum asked me what kind of special present would you like, and after I heard about you doing this thing, I thought, well, I'd quite like to do one of those genetic tests too. And one of the things I'm really interested to see is whether I have any Jewish heritage, because it's part of our family folklore that we have some Jewish heritage somewhere. The part of Scotland that my mother comes from in the 19th century had a lot of Eastern European immigration. And so...
Do you know when?
In kind of like, it would have been around the time of the pogroms in Russia and the Russian Empire. So there's always been this kind of family folklore that we've got Jewish heritage. So I'd be interested to see that. I was joking with you when you were doing this thing that you would get it back and it would just be a map of the world and it would all be blank apart from Lincolnshire. And I was thinking, I'll get mine back and it'll all be blank apart from, the lowlands of Scotland and Surrey. But I'll be interested to see how that turns out.
But it goes to show you how shrouded all this is, because I identify from Lincolnshire simply because I grew up there. But my parents are from London and Banbury. So, and my mother grew up in Wales because of the war and the Blitz and so on. So there's no genetic attachment to Lincolnshire. I just spent my childhood there. My family folklore was that we're French. And that in one click on our website was completely squashed. So
experience would indicate that perhaps I don't have any Jewish heritage.
Expect the least expected when you do it. I'm really looking forward to you getting it done now. I'd like to see what your genetic map is.
Of course, I'm going to be quite Scandinavian because, listeners might not know, but I have red hair, so that's a sure sign that you have some Viking heritage.
Yeah.
But I'm a very different kind of Viking from Simon. I'm kind of a Viking librarian. So let's get on to this week's essay, which is As I Please 45.
And can I interrupt you there?
Yes.
Before you go into specifics about what this essay is about, this is for me and maybe for the listener. What is this As I Please thing? Because there's about, how many essays are there entitled As I Please?
About 60 odd.
So there's As I Please 1 all the way through to 60. It confused me. So could you explain what this is?
Yes.
What does it mean?
We're working from the brilliant selected essays of George Orwell published by Everyman. And there are about 65 of these essays entitled As I Please, and then the number in the sequence. Now, George Orwell, after he became a more well-known, more successful writer, the newspaper, the Tribune, gave him a regular column. And because he was allowed to write about anything that took his fancy, anything he was interested in, he decided just to name this column As I Please. So every week or so, it was intermittent, he would publish this column on any subject he was interested in.
That's when you've made it as a columnist, isn't it? When the editor says, do what you want, we know people are going to read it.
Quite right.
So Lewis, if the story was written of your life and the title was As I Please, what would be the subtitle?
That's an interesting question. As I Please, if you don't mind.
If that's okay. I knew you ought to be something like that. I think mine would be As I Please, and I did.
So, Simon, right off the bat, what did you think of this essay? Very short essay.
It wasn't what I expected. Like I told you, I wasn't aware of what you just described with the As I Please series. But having read it, I get it now. It's just Orwell venting. He's just... How frequent was the essay? The column.
I think it was... Again, I think it was as he pleased, but I think it was generally weekly, or it's probably why there are so many of them.
So he's just going about his day, and then he reads something or hears something, and he vents through this column. And as we'll discuss with this one, he reads something somewhere, doesn't he? And it gets him thinking about something so perhaps not obvious as the pith helmet.
Yes.
And what it signifies. We'll talk about that more in depth.
Yes, we'll get on to what the pith helmet is in a moment. Just to reiterate, we're reading As I Please, which was published in the Tribune, 20th of October, 1944. Let's start by, as we always do, summarising.
He had an epiphany.
Yes, I found this, Simon, I found this a very pithy essay.
Okay.
And I was worried when I suggested reading this that you would think I was taking the piss.
Why does the word lisp have an S in it? That's just cruel.
Yes, that's a good point. It's how the world's run, the cruel way the world's run. To summarise this essay, Orwell mentions that he was reading a book about the fighting in Burma. As this essay was published, the Second World War was drawing to a close, but there was still very fierce fighting in the Asian and Pacific theatres of the war. And he was reading a book about the fighting in Burma between the British Empire troops and the Japanese imperial troops. And he mentions this point, which seems very by the by, that the British troops are not fighting wearing pith helmets. They're fighting wearing slouch hats. Now, I think we need to tell the listeners, don't we, Simon, what a pith helmet is before we go ahead.
Well, I would say to the listener, think of any imperial image and what are they wearing on their head? In a tropical or a hot environment, which invariably the empire was. And it's wide-rimmed.
Yes.
Tall-peaked. And made of
pith.
Made of pith,
which is
cork.
Cork from a certain kind of tree, I think.
I think it's an Indian swamp plant, and they dry it out, and it's a very tough material.
And
so,
also,
was it just pith, or was it cork covered in pith, or maybe a combination?
I think you might be right. Cork covered in pith, but I'll take your word for it.
Have you ever worn one?
I have actually. Yeah. So, as you know, my dad keeps bees. My mum and dad keep bees. And, of course, we have a lot of...
your dad keeps the peace. Sorry.
He keeps the peace with the bees, yeah. So, we have a lot of, beekeepers have to wear veils so that the bees don't sting them. And when I was about...
And they're shy.
Hey! They wear veils and they wear special equipment to stop the bees from stinging them. When I was about 11, 12, my dad bought some beekeeping equipment that included pith helmets. And you would put the helmet on and then you would put the veil on top of the helmet. And because the pith helmet has a very wide brim, it keeps the veil away from your face. So if you lean over, the bees can't sting you through the veil.
You can breathe.
We'll get on to this later, but I've got to tell you right now, I love pith helmets. I really love wearing them and I love the look of them. I think we can talk more about this later, but my dad buying a pith helmet, or a couple of pith helmets, was a great event in my childhood. So anyway, Orwell mentions that the British troops in Burma are not wearing these pith helmets, these helmets that are associated with British imperialism, but they're wearing slouch hats, which, again, slouch hat, imagine a kind of wide-brimmed hat with one of the brims pinned up. Kind of what we imagine as kind of typical Australian
Think
hat.
Gallipoli.
Yes, if you've ever seen the film Gallipoli, something like that. And
you know it was a real battle.
Of course.
If you've ever seen the film.
Well, what do you mean? You mean it wasn't just...
Think Gallipoli. If you've ever seen the film Gallipoli, or if you've ever seen any real photographs from the Gallipoli
from the terrible Gallipoli. You mean it wasn't just a Mel Gibson vehicle?
No, it wasn't.
You'll be telling me that...
On that topic, and we're going to talk about British Empire today, what's Mel Gibson got against particularly the English in their role in empire? I'm thinking Gallipoli, The Patriot, Braveheart.
That's a good point, and it's quite...
Piss off, Gibson! So yeah, what's Gibson's problem?
I don't know. I'd never thought about that before. Maybe because I'm a Scotsman, but
Well, what do you think about Braveheart, the movie?
can I say something shocking as a Scotsman that I've never actually watched Braveheart all the way through because I'm very big. You know, I love history, much like
Yeah.
yourself. I'm very big on historical accuracy, and I just
In
can't
movies.
in movies, and I
Okay.
can't watch Braveheart because I just keep thinking that's not what happened. He wasn't from a Highland village. He was a Norman knight. What are you
Yeah.
doing with the story?
Bloody good movie, though.
Well, my
Freedom. His guts hanging out.
that's your favourite bit.
I was like, you go to a cinema in London, everyone's like, yeah, that's what happens, Mel.
That's what you get.
Yeah.
Anyway, what were we talking about? I think we were talking about George Orwell essay.
Oh, the slouch.
Yes, slouch hats. So, British troops, end of the war, not wearing pith helmets. They were wearing these slouch hats. And then Orwell goes on to write about how this is quite significant when you think about the culture of British imperialism.
Why are slouch hats pinned up on one side?
Oh, it's because I know this. And
Do you get to choose the side? Oh, my right side.
No, I'm very excited to tell you about this because usually you're the military history expert, but I know the answer to this. So, slouch hats, yes, are pinned up
guns,
on one side because it depends which hand you use for which hand your trigger finger is on. So if it's pinned up on the right side, then you're a right-handed person and you're shooting with your right hand.
You just don't have a lovely complexion when looked at from the west.
Yes, from the west. Now then, Orwell goes on to make a point about how the pith helmet was not only a symbol of British imperialism, but British people used the pith helmet as a kind of excuse for empire, because it was all about the idea that Europeans, and particularly Northern Europeans, British people, were more susceptible to the heat than quote unquote natives. And he writes here that, again, this is quoting Orwell, natives, their skulls being thicker, had no need of these helmets, but for a European, even a double felt hat was not reliable protection. He means from the sun. And then he goes on to write about how the science behind this is very suspect, and how, again, I'm quoting Orwell here, take your topi, the topi is the Hindi word for the pith helmet, take your topi off in the open for one moment, even for one moment, and you may be a dead man. And then he tells a very interesting story, and I think you might have found this story interesting too, Simon, about how he believed Orwell was part of the British imperial apparatus as a young man. He was in the Indian Imperial Police in Burma, and so he was right on the ground administering the empire. But when he was in Burma, he started to get disillusioned with British imperialism, which, as a public school boy and as an upper middle class man in the 1900s, he'd been brought up to believe in. But then when he went out to Burma, his own experience started to turn him against imperialism. And there's a very Orwellian story here, again, quoting Orwell. My own disbelief in all this idea that Europeans, their skulls were thinner and so that they needed to wear these solar topis, these pith helmets. My own disbelief in all this dated from the day when my topi was blown off my head and carried away down a stream, leaving me to march bareheaded all day without ill effects. So there's Orwell discovering, when he goes out to Burma, that the things he has been taught, something very basic like, oh, you're a European, so you need to wear this hat all the time or you'll die, it's a lie. And then you can just imagine Orwell thinking, well, what else have I been lied to about?
Do you believe that story? Or do you think that story is a metaphor for his gradual understanding of what was meant?
That's a good point.
I think Orwell was far too astute to just have this one empirical event where he didn't faint without his hat for an afternoon and suddenly thought, wait a minute, have the last 100 years of social Darwinism been a lie? I believe he's using this story as a
It's a kind of
metaphor.
light bulb. It's
yeah.
like Isaac Newton getting the apple on his falling
Exactly,
on his
which
head,
is a
isn't it?
wonderful metaphor for what was actually years and years of research. And I think years and years of thinking. He's just summed it up in this story here.
And then he goes on to say, why should there be this whole folklore around sunstroke in India? And it's because of the whole idea of British superiority. And it's funny because it's the idea of British superiority, but it's also the idea of British delicacy. It's the idea that British people have very thin skulls, they're very delicate. But that
What's the significance of the supposed master race having a thinner skull than natives?
Well, I would think it'd be something to do with the brain, wouldn't it?
Well, evolution evolved more, hence
and
there's
I think
more space within the skull for the brain and less space for bone mass.
And I think later on you and I might talk more about how the different stages of empire and how after Darwin the justification for empire became much more scientific and racial, or I should say pseudo-scientific.
Yeah.
And then he goes on to say that it's significant now that, I'll quote it here, that is why it seems to me a sign of the changing times. This is 3 years before the British Empire starts to break up. It's a sign of the changing times that Wingate's men, we'll come back to Wingate, Wingate's men, British, Indians and Burmese alike, set forth in ordinary felt hats. So here are 3 different races fighting together, wearing the same uniform. And we've got to think, what is the symbolism of that, particularly to Orwell?
When something is represented by a symbol, once you dismantle the symbol, you dismantle the structure, you dismantle everything behind it.
So Simon, let's discuss this a bit. So going back to the beginning, Orwell mentions the Chindits. The Chindits were a special force fighting the Imperial Japanese Army in Burma using guerrilla tactics. Are you familiar with them, Simon? I know you're really into military history.
I am familiar with them, yeah. Do you know why the Chindits were necessary? First of all, what was this force in particular? What were they protecting?
They were protecting India.
India, which was if we lost India, the British involvement in the Second World War was in doubt, because India had become so important, not only because of its populace, which we were increasingly dipping into as a fighting force, but we were getting our raw materials from India.
And if Japan invaded India, Japan would really have complete control of most of Asia. The Japanese Empire would have triumphed in their goals.
Exactly. And then they'd have got to the Suez and blocked all the trade routes into Great Britain. And the border between what we would now call Bangladesh and going over to Burma, which we should mention now for people maybe not aware, is Myanmar. It's rugged terrain. There's no open fighting there, which really suited us, because in all the open fighting, such as Singapore, the Japanese were just overwhelming us. So it kind of suited us that we could revert to, and it's ironic in that we protected our empire with guerrilla warfare, whereas it had always been guerrilla warfare that we had to counter.
And also, as Orwell mentions later in the essay, the Chindits were a mixed force, weren't they? Yeah. They were British soldiers, Nepalese Gurkhas, and Indian soldiers all fighting together.
But we should mention always British officers.
Yes.
And British NCOs.
So the pith helmet, I mentioned before, I love pith helmets. It's just, Simon, do you have these things that from childhood, these objects, these images, I don't know, do you have these things that from childhood you've always loved? Because for me, from a young age, I've always loved pith helmets for some reason.
Not pith helmets. For me, pith helmets were always when you watched a movie on TV about the old days. Or when I remember way back when I watched The Jewel in the Crown. And I didn't really appreciate it then, but I thought of the pith helmet through that. But when I was a child, there's two things really. I used to collect football stickers, where you get a book with each team, and you have to collect the stickers each week and stick them on each player. And as a result of that, I am now in my approach, creaking into middle age. I'm obsessed with lists, ticking off things. I make lists which I have to do. Like when you come into my house where we're recording this, there's a map of Japan, and I'm putting a star on each prefecture as I visit. I'm obsessed with that. And that might stem from that. And on my 8th birthday, for Christmas, my present was a globe, which you plugged in and switched, and it lit up.
Wow.
and rotated. And I was obsessed with this globe. The best gift I've ever received to this day. And as you know me well, I've traveled to over 70 countries in my time, and I spent many years of my life effectively as a globetrotter. And I can't help thinking if there's some subconscious relation to all those hours I would sit there staring at that globe. I used to be able to tell you every capital city in the world.
Kenya.
Nairobi. But don't forget, a lot of these capital cities have changed since then. But
Venezuela.
Caracas.
That was an easy one.
Come on, challenge me.
Georgia.
Tbilisi.
Mongolia.
Ulaanbaatar. No, it's one of my few talents. The problem is the really obscure ones. You don't want to ask me those because I could say anything. You might not know either.
The Falkland Islands.
Stanley.
Oh, of course. But then
it's Fort Stanley, isn't it? Or Port Stanley.
We have cultural history there, so.
Anyway,
I think we got onto this because I said as a child I loved helmets, and I think it's because I was really into history, and I've always quite liked historical costume as well. And the Pith helmet is very much the symbol of British imperialism, isn't it?
Have you ever been, or do you think you will ever go to any historical reenactments where you get to dress up and...
This is something I wanted to bring up, actually, because I heard...
As you please.
I heard recently that in Britain, the vintage clothing community, there's been a bit of a row over the Pith helmet.
Okay.
Because there are people who say that a white man turning up at a vintage clothes rally or event in a Pith helmet is using a symbol of oppression, of imperialist oppression, and literally making fun out of what is a symbol.
What do you think about that?
Well, I do think in a way it's fair enough because it's a very loaded symbol, isn't it? And you just have to read an essay like this to realise, oh, actually, the Pith helmet does symbolise ideas of racial superiority. What do you make of it?
It's context, isn't it? You've got to be able to read context as to the motives of why someone's wearing it. If they're just appreciating vintage clothing, then it's okay. If they're clearly insinuating an imperial past and relating it to the present, then I have a problem with that. But would you be offended if someone turned up with a Viking helmet?
No,
because they weren't cherubs.
It's not really too soon, though, is it?
If I turned up as a Roman legion, would you think the villages of northern France would all be writing letters to the editor to complain?
I don't know. That sounds a bit like whataboutism to me, though.
Yeah, I know. But when's the cutoff point? You said too soon, but so when we're talking? So when did the Pith helmet start to go out of fashion? Late 40s, early 50s,
early 50s.
So it's 80 years.
But we're still living with the legacy of empire, aren't we?
Mate, I'm 44% Scandinavian.
It's all linking up.
I'm still living with the legacy of Viking pillage.
Still, the legacy of empire is a lot more immediate than that. And
true.
Talking of Burma, modern day Myanmar, they're definitely living with the legacy of empire, as we've seen in the last few months.
Absolutely, the military that doesn't seem to be able to let it go, and the system that was created, the corrupt system that was created from empire.
Which happens a lot when an imperial power leaves and doesn't really leave anything in place. or deliberately puts a certain group in place to help their commercial and defence interests.
Do you know a group from the early 20th century in England called the Libertines? An indie rock group.
Yes, yes.
They used to...
You say early 20th century.
Oh, sorry, early 21st century.
I was going to say they don't. Say, I don't think there was
a jazz band.
I was going to say I don't think there was Edwardian rock.
So yeah,
I was going to say,
century.
are you thinking about Evelyn Waugh or something? A libertine in the early 20th century.
Well, they're kind of their lyrics from their songs and their image as being libertines. They're very libertarian, very bohemian, but they used to dress up in imperial,
like red
jackets, uniforms. No one said a thing. I don't know if it was a form of irony or whether
late 90s, early 2000s, it was a big time for irony, wasn't it?
Yeah, it'd be interesting. So I say it's context, like I said before. I'm pretty sure that those four lads in that band weren't trying to invoke, although they had one of their songs was called Albion, which is the ideal image of England.
But it sounds like they were trying to do a bit of a kind of Kinks sort of thing, but maybe not as successfully as the Kinks.
Well, that's another thing about the Kinks. With Ray Davies, he's a bit of a little Englander, isn't he? Like,
no, I would
his
actually
whole
argue,
album on the Victorian values.
I would argue against that. I think we'll probably get onto this in another podcast, but I think the Kinks are quite Orwellian in their appreciation of English culture, because I think that they sing about the best things about English culture while criticizing the worst things. Think about a song like Village Green Preservation Society, which is all about what is it? Preserving the old ways from being abused, protecting the new ways for me and for you. So it's preserving what's good about English culture and protecting the new ways, protecting the new freedoms.
But the song Victoria is going on about how we used to have an empire and what a pity it is we don't anymore.
But don't you find it's also
Victoria
in a way
ruled them all?
Yes, but then it's also satirizing the traditional view of.
But where's the satire in that?
Well,
song?
remember, long ago, something, sex was bad, cold, obscene. Now, I don't think guys in the 60s would agree that sex was bad and should be cold, obscene. So I think there was a heavy amount of satire. I've also seen some great interviews with Ray Davies where he's really criticising the modern political situation in Britain. So I think there's more to it than that.
How old are your parents?
Oh, they're kind of late 60s.
So what were they doing in the 60s?
Well, they were they were still finishing up school. Dad started work by about 68, 69.
It was a long-haired biker, right?
He was long-haired.
And that was the late 60s.
My mum was a hippie too.
Oh, really? My dad was a paratrooper. I don't think he had the.
Don't think he had long hair.
Yeah, I don't think he had the 60s experience you see on the Pith film.
Going back to the essay, Orwell mentions that the pith helmet was also referred to as the topi, or the solar topi. Simon, that reminds me. Did you watch that brilliant version?
Say, I found a 2p for you, cheeky bastard.
No, you don't need it quite yet. But did you watch that brilliant version of Hamlet, which was set during the British Raj?
No. It's
on YouTube. You should watch it because there's this bit where Hamlet comes out and he says, "Topi,
knew it,
or not topi."
Is this Carry On Shakespeare?
I'm just trying to make. We haven't mentioned the pun jar in a while, and I'm just trying to make up for lost time.
Good one.
I like that. So, you mentioned before how Orwell is kind of saying, this is nonsense. I had this epiphany, but I liked how you read it, that this was actually the distillation of what he realized rather than like one Newton moment.
Yeah, I don't think Orwell has eureka moments.
So finishing up, what do you think of the way he brings it together at the end, saying, Wingate's men, British, Indians, and Burmese alike, set forth in ordinary felt hats. It's very quite egalitarian. It's a bit propaganda as well, isn't it? Have you seen that famous poster from the Second World War, which is a poster of Commonwealth troops marching shoulder to shoulder?
Yes, yeah.
I'll maybe put that on Instagram if I can for our listeners. It's this beautiful
We
image.
should be able to. That's probably owned by the Imperial War Museum or something, which means we should be able to post that.
It's an image of like a Canadian troop, a Canadian soldier, a British soldier, Indian soldier, maybe an Australian
And the
soldier.
Australian is wearing the slouch hat.
They're wearing the slouch hat. And they're all marching shoulder to shoulder in defence of the Empire and Commonwealth. So do you think Orwell's being a bit propaganda in this essay?
I think he is. He knows that we need the Commonwealth for demographic reasons, for troops to fight. And don't forget he's working for the BBC at this time, isn't he, as a kind of propagandist. And I think that's carried into this essay. Or do you think he sees ahead? He sees Attlee, what he's doing, and what he's predicting that he's going to win after the Second World War. And we are going to be a country which is going to be desperately short of manpower. And we'll have to open up to the Empire with regards to immigration. And he's foreseeing that and getting his word in about integration and working together.
I think there's definitely some of that there. I think Orwell knows that a change is coming. He knows that as soon as the war is over, and this was after the Normandy landings, I think. Let me just double check, actually.
So the Normandy landings were 6th of June 44?
This was October 44. So even though...
So we've started to really... We've broken the breach. We're pushing into... It's obvious that the war in Europe is coming to an end.
So I think Orwell knew, or he felt at least, that the tide was turning and that British imperialism and this idea of racial superiority could not outlast the war.
Yeah.
We didn't mention earlier, but...
Because they've been fighting shoulder to shoulder.
Yes. And we didn't mention earlier, but when I was...
soldier to soldier.
Hand to hand. We didn't mention earlier that the stages... I don't know if you learned this at university, Simon, but I learned at university that the British Empire...
Does it involve Jägermeister?
No.
So then no, is the answer.
Please don't tell any of the listeners some of the things you learned at university.
Yeah, then the answer's no.
We were told that the British Empire went through 3 or 4 distinct phases. It started off as trade. It then, the trading companies like the East India Company...
Can I plug my YouTube channel?
Please do,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Go to 4 Minute Histories, you can learn about this.
If you want to learn about the British Empire, go to 4 Minute Histories. It's brilliant. British Empire started off as trade, then the trading companies started interfering in the local politics of the countries, and then it became more like a kind of...
Through the
East India
Company. Yeah.
And was there a West India Company too?
There was a West India Company, but it was Spanish.
I see.
And ironically, it's what they operated in the Philippines. Because they always assumed that you had to go the long way around to get there. Yeah.
So started off as trade, then interfering in politics, then the missionaries moved in, and it became, when the missionaries moved in, the empire became about spreading Christian values. Then it became about spreading Western or European values. After Darwin, so from like the 1870s, 1880s, the empire, to support the empire, it became a kind of it became underpinned by ideas of racial
the spreading of Western values actually don't predate Darwinism. They kind of coincide. So pre-Darwinism, it was very economic, and there wasn't much racial theory. And my question for you is, when we speak about thick skulls, thin skulls, social Darwinism, do the British believe they are racially superior, so they are extolling these virtues, or do they know they need a justification for their policies, and they found a convenient outlet in social Darwinism? Which one do you think it is?
Well, this is the thing. Call me a cynic if you will, but I think it's just an excuse, really.
I agree with you. I don't think these policymakers sitting in Westminster truly believed in social Darwinism.
Yes, it was just an excuse for why we could go into a country with guns and say, okay, all this is ours now. Oh, why are we here? Why should you let us take all this? It's because we're superior.
I should disclose here, I'm heavily influenced by the concept of Orientalism by Edward Said. And in a nutshell, that basically is where the Western imperial powers would demean the natives of the countries they had colonized in order to justify their presence, their superiority. Exactly how, and Orwell is speaking 40 years before the publication of Orientalism. The book Orientalism was the book that's pretty much started the whole ideology of post-colonialism.
So Orwell is kind of pre-post-colonial.
It's the genius of the man. He's a post-colonialist before post-colonialism.
I'd be very interested to know if Edward Said knew about this essay.
I bet you he did, you know. I bet you he did. He's a very astute man, Edward Said. I know, do you know Frantz Fanon?
No.
He wrote a book called Wretched of the Earth. So he was a French...
Algerian.
Not a French Algerian. He was from Martinique. But he was very Orwellian. So
Still a colony of France. Of course.
Yeah, but he fought with the Algerian Liberation Force in the Algerian War of Independence, yeah. And was a very influential post-colonialist writer. And I'd recommend anyone to read his book, Wretched of the Earth. And he openly said he was a big fan of George Orwell. And George Orwell's books had inspired him in his ideologies.
So there you have it, everyone. If you're a student of post-colonialism, Orientalism, read this Orwell essay because he knew what was going on before Edward Said.
He's summing up Edward Said's entire philosophy in this book about how we are using this subjugation and diminution of native populace to justify our presence. And for presence, I'm talking synonymously with superiority, or supposed superiority.
So, Simon, let's finish there because we're nearly at 50 minutes and I want to keep it pithy.
Oh, dear.
And I think you need to go for a pith.
Good one.
So because this week we've been talking about Orwell's As I Please column, it's inspired us to do something a bit different next week. Next week, Simon and I will be doing As We Please. We're going to talk about...
hedonism.
Yes, and...
letting it go, letting your hair down, because letting my hair down would be pretty pathetic.
Be a bit dangerous for you, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
So we're going to do As We Please next week. So if you want to hear Simon and I talking without an essay to encumber us, then please tune in next week.
It will be Orwellian. We'll be talking about themes relevant to Orwell's being, but it will just be a bit more ad hoc.
Looser,
Yeah.
comfort fit.
Yeah.
All right,
It'll
everyone.
be pyjamas to today's suit
Today,
and pith helmet.
Today's suit and pith. Next week, pith helmet and pajamas. All right, everyone. Thanks for listening. Oh, I should probably mention we're on most of the podcast platforms, aren't we, Simon? Apple Pods, Google Pods. We're on Spotify. We have an
Audible,
Instagram
Amazon,
page. Oh, and please
Twitter.
write to us. orwellpod@gmail.com. We would really love to hear from you. Okay, everyone.
And a big shout out to our fan. We have a fan, so
And his friend.
yeah, makeup friend. So a big shout out to you, fan.
Hi, Mum and Dad. Hi, Simon, Mum and Dad. Okay, thanks for listening, everyone. Orwell the Dead as well.
Oh, God.